The courtroom fell silent as 62-year-old Walter Freeman stood tall, his weathered fingers tracing the Purple Heart pinned to his chest. "Remove it or face contempt," Judge Barrett snarled. Walter locked eyes with him and whispered, "I died for this medal 20 years before you put on that robe." Before I continue this powerful story of one man's stand against injustice, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Has anyone in your family served in the military? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when the whole system is against you. Now let's dive into how a decorated veteran's quiet dignity sparked a national movement. Walter Freeman never intended to become a symbol of resistance. On that crisp autumn morning, the 62-year-old Black Army veteran with 32 years of distinguished service simply responded to his civic duty when he received a jury summons from the Birmingham, Alabama courthouse. The pain in his right leg, a permanent souvenir from a Desert Storm firefight, flared as he limped toward his modest sedan. Walter had considered requesting an exemption, given his health issues from combat injuries, but something about abandoning a responsibility didn't sit right with the career soldier. His morning routine included careful attention to his appearance, a habit instilled during decades of military service. Walter meticulously pressed his dress blues, polished the brass buttons until they gleamed in the early light, and arranged his medals with precision across his chest. The Purple Heart held the position of honor, testament to the day in 1991, when an enemy bullet found his flesh but couldn't break his resolve. Each medal told a story of sacrifice, not just his own, but of brothers and sisters in arms who fought alongside him. Walter believed wearing his uniform represented the highest respect he could show the judicial system, another institution he had sworn to defend with his life. He didn't know that this simple decision would set in motion events that would reshape the very system he revered. The Birmingham County Courthouse stood imposing against the Alabama sky, its classical columns and stone facade projecting authority and permanence. Inside, Walter's highly polished shoes clicked rhythmically on the marble floor, drawing curious glances from security personnel and fellow citizens reporting for jury duty. Most moved respectfully aside, a few nodded acknowledgments, others whispered behind cupped hands. Walter had grown accustomed to the reactions his uniform elicited, both respectful and otherwise. The jury assembly room buzzed with conversation that quickly hushed as Walter entered. He found a seat near the back, his tall frame still military straight, despite the years and injuries. Within minutes, he noticed a pattern as the court officials called potential jurors for questioning. Black candidates seemed to face more scrutiny, more dismissals for increasingly dubious reasons. Walter observed, silently, his face betraying no emotion, another skill honed through decades of service under sometimes questionable leadership. A white bailiff with a ruddy complexion and an ill-fitting uniform approached, looking Walter up and down with undisguised skepticism. "You'll need to remove your costume before entering the courtroom," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Slightly. Walter met his gaze steadily. "This is not a costume, sir. These are my service medals earned during 32 years in the United States Army." The bailiff rolled his eyes. "Sure, Grandpa, whatever you say. Just take off the Halloween outfit before Judge Barrett sees you." Before Walter could respond, his group number was called. Despite the encounter, he proceeded to the courtroom with dignity intact, back straight as a flagpole. Courtroom 3B belonged to Judge Richard Barrett, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. Barrett had served on the bench for 15 years, known for his strict courtroom decorum and controversial rulings that disproportionately affected minorities. The judge's gaze immediately locked onto Walter as he entered, eyes narrowing at the sight of the decorated uniform. Walter could feel the weight of that stare, but kept his focus forward. A veteran of scrutiny far more dangerous than this. The case before them involved a young black man, barely 20, accused of shoplifting from an upscale boutique. Despite the minor nature of the alleged crime, the prosecutor was pushing for maximum penalties due to a previous juvenile offense. The evidence seemed circumstantial at best, primarily the word of a store manager against the defendants. Walter recognized the familiar pattern, having seen his own son face similar presumptions of guilt years earlier. During jury selection, Walter answered questions truthfully and succinctly, drawing on his military precision. When asked if he could be impartial, he replied, "I have sworn to uphold justice for all Americans, regardless of their background. That oath didn't expire with my service." Something in his calm assurance seemed to satisfy both counsels, and Walter found himself selected for the jury, one of only 2 black jurors in a predominantly white panel. During a recess, Walter stood in the hallway, stretching his aching leg when he overheard Judge Barrett speaking to his clerk around the corner. "These people need to learn their place," Barrett said in a hushed but clear voice. "Coming in here like they own the place. This isn't the 60s anymore. We have order now." The clerk's response was inaudible, but Barrett's dismissive laugh carried. "Just make sure we keep the right kind of people on these juries. You know what I mean." Walter's face remained impassive, but his grip tightened on his cane. He'd heard similar sentiments throughout his life and career, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. The words themselves no longer had the power to wound him, but the injustice they represented still burned like phosphorus. When court resumed, Barrett's gaze kept returning to Walter, particularly to the medals across his chest. The Purple Heart seemed to especially draw the judge's attention, his expression growing increasingly irritated as the afternoon wore on. When Walter was asked a follow-up question by the defense attorney, he answered with the same steady confidence that had guided him through firefights and peacekeeping missions. "I understand the responsibility of determining another person's fate," Walter said. "It's not unlike the responsibility of command, where your decisions affect the lives of those under your protection." Barrett interrupted. "Mr. Freeman, we're not in the military now. This is my courtroom, and I make the rules here." Walter nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor. I was simply drawing a parallel about the weight of responsibility." Several other jurors nodded in agreement, and Barrett's complexion darkened slightly. That night, Walter returned to his modest home in the historically black neighborhood of Smithfield. Photos lined the walls, telling the story of his life. Walter as a young recruit standing proud in his first uniform. Walter with his unit in Desert Storm, arms around buddies who wouldn't all make it home. Walter receiving his Purple Heart from a general whose name most Americans would recognize. Walter with his late wife Evelyn on their 30th anniversary, shortly before cancer took her. Walter with his daughter Tanya and grandson Marcus at the young man's high school graduation. Each image captured a moment of a life dedicated to service, to family, to doing what was right even when it came at great personal cost. The pain in his leg throbbed worse than usual as he prepared for bed. The doctors at the VA had told him the nerve damage would likely worsen with age, but Walter refused stronger medication, preferring clarity of mind to comfort of body. As he carefully hung his uniform, fingers lingering on the Purple Heart, Walter had no way of knowing that tomorrow, this small piece of metal and ribbon would become the centerpiece of a battle for dignity that would echo far beyond the walls of courtroom 3B. The morning of day 2 dawned with a clarity that reminded Walter of mornings in the desert, the kind of crisp air that seemed to amplify every sound and sharpen every color. Once again, he donned his uniform with methodical precision, each button and medal placed with the care of ritual. The Purple Heart seemed especially vibrant against the dark fabric, a splash of color representing blood spilled in service. Walter arrived early, sitting quietly in the courthouse corridor when a court officer approached. "Judge Barrett wants to see you in his chambers," the young man said, not quite meeting Walter's eyes. "Before proceedings begin." Walter nodded, leveraging himself up with his cane. The walk to Barrett's chambers took him past portraits of previous judges, a sea of white faces staring down from ornate frames. Barrett's office spoke of privilege and power, with leather-bound law books lining mahogany shelves and framed credentials. Covering one wall, golf trophies occupied a place of prominence on a side table, alongside photos of Barrett with various politicians and business leaders. The judge himself sat behind an imposing desk, not rising when Walter entered, not offering a seat. "Mr. Freeman," Barrett began without preamble, "your military regalia is inappropriate for my courtroom. It could unduly influence other jurors and prejudice them toward your opinions during deliberations." Walter stood at parade rest, the position as natural to him as breathing. With respect, Your Honor, there's no rule against wearing military decorations in a courtroom. I wear them not to influence, but to honor the oath I took to defend the Constitution, the same Constitution that guarantees the right to a fair trial. Barrett's face tightened. My courtroom, my rules, Mr. Freeman. I want all medals and military insignia removed when you return tomorrow. Is that clear? Walter took a measured breath. Sir, these medals represent 32 years of service to our country. This Purple Heart in particular was awarded after I nearly died saving my unit from an ambush. 3 men went home to their families because of the actions recognized by this medal. Barrett waved a dismissive hand. We all make choices, Mr. Freeman. I chose law school while others chose the military. Different paths, different rewards. The casual disregard stung more than Walter expected. May I ask, Your Honor, did you serve? Barrett's eyes narrowed. That's irrelevant, but since you ask, I received a deferment during Vietnam. My father felt my talents would be wasted in the jungle. Walter noticed the judge's watch, a Rolex. That likely cost more than Walter's monthly pension. Photos on the credenza showed Barrett at exclusive golf clubs, the kind that had denied membership to black Americans for decades. Some still did unofficially. Tomorrow, no medals, Barrett repeated, his tone indicating dismissal. Or you'll be found in contempt. I won't have my authority challenged in my own courtroom. Walter maintained his composure. I understand your position, Your Honor. He didn't agree, but 32 years in the military had taught him when to fight and when to strategize. That evening, Walter sat at his kitchen table with his grandson Marcus, a second-year law student at Howard University, home on break. It's ridiculous, Marcus said, fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. There's no legal basis for his demand. Military decorations aren't prohibited in courtrooms. In fact, there are cases supporting your right to wear them. The young man's indignation warmed Walter's heart, reminding him of his own youthful fire. The judge has authority over his courtroom, Walter replied, playing devil's advocate. Marcus shook his head vehemently. Authority, yes. Arbitrary power, no, there are limits, Grandpa. Barrett can't just make up rules because your presence makes him uncomfortable. Walter sipped his tea, considering. Why do you think it bothers him so much? The uniform? The medals? Or just me? Marcus looked up from his research. All of it. You represent something he can't buy or bully. Genuine respect, genuine sacrifice. Men like Barrett are used to controlling the narrative. Your very existence challenges his story. Later that night, Walter visited Evelyn's grave at the Veterans Cemetery. The moonlight silvered the rows of identical headstones, democracy in death if not always in life. What would you tell me to do, Evie? He whispered, placing a small stone on her marker as he always did. They'd been married 40 years before cancer took her 3 years ago. She'd been his moral compass, his strength, when PTSD darkened his mind, his joy when the world seemed determined to grind him down. In the stillness, he could almost hear her voice. Stand your ground, Walter Freeman, stand your ground. On his way home, Walter's phone rang. His daughter Tanya's name flashed on the screen. Daddy, I heard about what happened with Judge Barrett, she said without preamble. Marcus told me, you need to be careful. Tanya had inherited her mother's directness and her father's sense of justice. As a community organizer focusing on voter rights, she knew the power structures of Birmingham intimately. Barrett has connections, Daddy, real connections, the kind that can make problems for people who cross them. Walter stopped at a red light, watching a young couple cross the street hand in hand, unaware of his small drama playing out across town. I'm not looking to cross anyone, baby girl. I'm just not willing to dishonor what these medals stand for. Tanya's sigh carried years of worry for her father. I know, Daddy, just be prepared. Barrett doesn't lose gracefully. After hanging up, Walter received 2 more calls, both from elderly veterans he knew from the VFW hall. Somehow, word had spread about his confrontation with Barrett. Don't you dare take those medals off, Freeman, said Jackson, who'd served in Vietnam. We're behind you all the way. Coleman, who'd fought in Korea, was more pragmatic. Watch your back, Walter. Judges have long memories and longer reaches. As Walter prepared for bed, memories flooded back unbidden. The searing heat of Desert Storm, the weight of a wounded comrade across his shoulders, the white-hot pain when the sniper's bullet found his thigh, the months of rehabilitation, learning to walk again. Throughout his service, Walter had faced discrimination even as he wore the uniform, being passed over for promotions that went to less qualified white soldiers, being mistaken for kitchen staff rather than a decorated officer, having to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Yet he'd persevered, believing that his service might help pave a smoother road for those who came after. Now, decades later, he faced the same battle in a different uniform. Before sleep claimed him, Walter made his decision. He would wear his medals tomorrow. He would stand his ground. But a worry nagged at him. If Barrett removed him from the jury, what would happen to the young defendant? Would losing a sympathetic juror doom the boy to a harsher sentence? The question followed Walter into uneasy dreams, where he ran through desert sands that turned to courthouse corridors, always pursuing something just beyond reach. Across town, unknown to Walter, a local newspaper reporter named Angela Chen was working late, following up on a tip about unusual tension in Judge Barrett's courtroom. A courthouse janitor had mentioned a confrontation with a black veteran juror, and Chen, always alert for stories of systemic inequity, began quietly investigating Barrett's history on the bench. The pieces were aligning for a confrontation that would extend far beyond one man and one judge, rippling outward to challenge assumptions about authority, respect, and whose dignity the law was designed to protect. Day 3 arrived with rain drumming against Walter's windows, the sky weeping as if in premonition. He moved with deliberate calm, each action measured and precise as he prepared for what might come. His uniform hung ready, medals in place, the Purple Heart catching the light as if alive with its own fire. In the bathroom mirror, Walter saw his father's face looking back at him, the same determined set to the jaw, the same unwavering gaze that had faced down segregation and served a country that often didn't serve him in return. The courthouse hummed with the usual morning activity when Walter arrived, but something had shifted. Eyes followed him more intently, conversations paused as he passed, and even the security guards seemed unusually alert to his presence. Walter recognized the atmosphere from combat zones, the electric tension before engagement. Courtroom 3B was nearly full when Walter entered, unusual for a routine shoplifting case. He noted several unfamiliar faces, including a young Asian woman with a reporter's notebook partially concealed in her lap. Judge Barrett's entrance silenced the room, the traditional all rise carrying an undertone of anticipation. Barrett took his seat, arranged his robes, and then looked directly at Walter, his eyes immediately locking onto the Purple Heart. The judge's face flushed visibly, a vein throbbing at his temple. "Mr. Freeman," Barrett called out, interrupting the clerk's opening procedures. "Approach the bench." Walter rose steadily, using his cane for support, and walked forward. The courtroom had gone completely silent, the kind of hush that falls when witnesses sense a moment of significance unfolding. "I instructed you to remove those medals, Mr. Freeman," Barrett said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have deliberately disobeyed a direct order from this court." Walter stood straight, his voice clear and carrying. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I am not in uniform today. I have chosen to wear only the Purple Heart, which was awarded to me after I was wounded in combat, defending our nation's interests and saving the lives of my fellow soldiers." Barrett's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Remove it now, Mr. Freeman, or I will find you in contempt of court." Walter felt the weight of every eye in the room, heard the slight rustle as the reporter shifted for a better view. In that moment, he saw not just Barrett but every obstacle he'd faced, every time he'd been told to make himself smaller, less visible, less deserving of the respect he'd earned. "This medal represents blood I shed for the Constitution that governs this very courtroom," Walter said, his voice steady. "I cannot and will not dishonor that sacrifice." Barrett's gavel came down with a crack like a gunshot. "You are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, remove Mr. Freeman from the jury pool immediately. Mr. Freeman, you are fined $1,000. Pay the clerk on your way out." The bailiff approached, looking uncomfortable with his assignment. As Walter turned to leave, something unprecedented happened. An elderly white man in the back row stood up. Then a middle-aged white woman beside him, then a young black man near the door. Within seconds, half the courtroom was standing in silent support. Barrett's face contorted in rage. "Sit down! All of you, sit down now or join Mr. Freeman in contempt." Slowly, reluctantly, people retook their seats, but the message had been delivered. Walter walked out with his head high, leaning on his cane but unbowed. In the corridor, the young reporter caught up to him. "Mr. Freeman, I'm Angela Chen from the Birmingham Post. Would you be willing to tell me your side of what just happened?" Walter considered the young woman, seeing earnestness behind her professional demeanor. "There are no sides, Ms. Chen, just right and wrong. Judge Barrett asked me to dishonor a sacrifice I made for this country. I declined." Chen's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. "Why do you think he specifically objected to your purple heart?" Walter paused. "That's a question for Judge Barrett. All I know is that this medal represents a day when I nearly died, making sure others could live. I won't pretend that didn't happen to make anyone more comfortable with my presence." By mid-afternoon, Chen's article had hit the paper's website with the headline, "Judge Orders Veteran to Dishonor His Sacrifice." It included a dignified photo of Walter standing on the courthouse steps, purple heart visible on his chest. The story spread rapidly, first locally, then regionally, then nationally as larger outlets picked it up. Barrett's chambers were soon flooded with calls and emails. Veterans groups across the country expressed outrage, with the VFW issuing a formal statement condemning the judge's actions as an affront to all who have bled for this nation. The courthouse began receiving small packages, each containing a purple heart-shaped piece of paper or fabric, a silent protest multiplying by the hour. Walter's home phone rang constantly until he unplugged it. His modest house in Smithfield became a magnet for news vans and reporters seeking comments. Through it all, Walter maintained his composure, declining most interviews and refusing to speak ill of Barrett. "This isn't about one judge," he told the few reporters he acknowledged. "It's about respect for sacrifice, regardless of who makes it. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up for what's right when it would have been easier to back down? Comment number 1 if you believe Walter was right to keep his purple heart on, or number 2 if you think he should have followed the judge's orders. Hit like if you respect veterans who have sacrificed for their country, and subscribe to hear how this confrontation escalates in ways no one could have predicted. What do you think will happen next as Judge Barrett faces growing public scrutiny? Will he back down or double down on his demands? Let's continue our story and find out. Judge Richard Barrett had never faced public scrutiny of this magnitude. The deluge of calls forced his clerk to disconnect the office phone. His email inbox overflowed with messages bearing subject lines like shame and disgrace to the bench. Local veterans announced plans to wear their medals to court in solidarity with Walter. Several high-profile military leaders issued statements questioning the legal basis for Barrett's order. The defendant's lawyer, sensing opportunity, filed a motion requesting Barrett recuse himself, citing potential bias. Barrett, however, was not a man accustomed to retreat. The morning after Chen's article appeared, he issued a formal statement doubling down on his position. The dignity of the court requires compliance with judicial directives. Mr. Freeman's grandstanding undermines the impartial administration of justice. The fine is hereby doubled, and Mr. Freeman faces imprisonment if he continues to defy this court's authority. Walter received this news from Marcus, who monitored developments while Walter attempted to restore some normalcy to his disrupted life. "He can't do this, Grandpa," Marcus insisted, pacing Walter's living room. "It's a clear overreach of judicial authority. We should file a complaint with the Judicial Ethics Committee." Walter watched his grandson, seeing the same fire that had driven his own career. "Let's consider all angles before we escalate," he counseled. "Barrett has had 15 years to build his fortress. We need to be strategic." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Walter opened it to find a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. "Mr. Freeman, I'm William Hargrove, court administrator for Jefferson County. May I come in?" Walter recognized the name, if not the face. Hargrove oversaw the administrative functions of all courts in the county, a powerful position with significant influence. Once seated in Walter's modest living room, Hargrove came directly to the point. This situation has gotten out of hand, Mr. Freeman. Judge Barrett feels his authority has been challenged, and the media attention is disrupting court operations. Walter waited, recognizing a negotiation opening when he heard one. The judge is willing to reduce the fine to a symbolic amount if you issue a public apology and acknowledge his authority in his courtroom. For the good of the system, Mr. Freeman. Walter considered the man before him, noting the careful neutrality of his expression, the way he presented Barrett's demand as a reasonable compromise. Mr. Hargrove, I spent 32 years defending a system that promises equal justice under law. I believed in that system enough to nearly die for it. What does it say about that system if it demands I apologize for wearing a medal that represents that sacrifice? Hargrove's expression didn't change. It says the system is run by human beings, Mr. Freeman, human beings with pride and power. Sometimes wisdom lies in knowing which battles to fight. After Hargrove left, Walter received another visitor, this one less expected. Detective James Morrison of the Birmingham Police Department arrived unannounced, his unmarked car pulling into Walter's driveway, just as dusk settled over the neighborhood. Just a friendly visit, Mr. Freeman, Morrison said, declining Walter's offer of coffee. Wanted to make sure you're doing all right with all this attention? Morrison's casual tone belied the intensity of his gaze as it swept through Walter's home, lingering on family photos and military memorabilia. You know, situations like this have a way of bringing scrutiny to people's lives, their families, their histories. He picked up a photo of Tanya at a voter registration drive. Your daughter does important work, community organizing, right? That's admirable. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Is there something specific I can help you with, Detective? Walter asked, his voice even. Morrison smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Not at the moment, just keeping lines of communication open. Judge Barrett is an important figure in our justice system, has a lot of friends in this town. It would be a shame if this situation escalated unnecessarily. After Morrison left, Walter called Marcus, only to hear disturbing news. My scholarship is suddenly under review, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger. The dean called me in today, said there were concerns about academic fit. This is retaliation, Grandpa, pure and simple. Walter felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Barrett's reach was proving longer than anticipated. The following day brought more concerning developments. Walter's military pension payment, normally direct deposited like clockwork, hadn't arrived. A call to the VA revealed his account was under administrative review, with no timeline for resolution. The local grocery store where Walter had shopped for years suddenly claimed his credit was no longer good. The owner, usually friendly, couldn't meet Walter's eyes as he delivered the news. The County Bar Association, after days of silence, finally issued a lukewarm statement supporting judicial authority while acknowledging the complex issues raised by this case. Walter noticed his mail arriving with evidence of having been opened, the envelopes carelessly resealed. His phone conversations had a subtle echo that hadn't been there before. Barrett's influential friends in local government began a whisper campaign questioning Walter's military record, suggesting the decorated veteran might have exaggerated his service or obtained medals through administrative error rather than merit. The rumors were absurd to anyone who knew Walter or had access to his distinguished service record, but they served their purpose of muddying the waters of public opinion. The pressure extended beyond Walter to his family. Tanya called, her voice strained, to report she'd been passed over for a promotion that had been all but guaranteed. The board member who blocked it plays golf with Barrett every Sunday, she said. This isn't coincidence, Daddy. Walter felt the weight of his stand pressing down on those he loved most. He sat alone in his kitchen that night, wondering if his principles were worth the cost being exacted from his family. Then his phone rang. The caller identified herself as Shanice Williams, mother of the young defendant in the original case. Mr. Freeman, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. My son Jamal, he's a good boy. Made some mistakes, yes, but he's not what they're making him out to be. She told Walter how Jamal had been repeatedly stopped by police in their affluent suburb, how a white friend wearing identical clothes had been ignored by the same officers, how shoplifting charges had been pressed despite store security footage showing Jamal nowhere near the allegedly stolen items. Judge Barrett has handled 3 of Jamal's cases, Shanice said. Each time maximum sentences, no benefit of the doubt. This system isn't built for boys who look like my son, or men who look like you, Mr. Freeman, uniform or no uniform. Her words strengthened Walter's resolve. That evening, he attended a VFW meeting where fellow veterans, both black and white, pledged support. Barrett's got friends in high places, warned Thomas Coleman, a Vietnam veteran who had served on the city council. The old money in this town sticks together. They won't let you win without a fight. Walter nodded, unsurprised. I didn't expect them to. But I've faced worse odds, with less support. He returned home to find his front door spray-painted with racial slurs, the hateful words gleaming wet in the porch light. Before he could react, neighbors appeared with paint remover and brushes, working silently to erase the ugliness. Young and old, black and white, they restored his home without being asked, a small community standing against hatred. The following morning, Walter received notice of a formal complaint filed against him with the Army, alleging conduct unbecoming, a veteran, and misrepresentation of military honors. The complaint came from an anonymous citizen, but bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Barrett's influence. Each escalation made the stakes clearer. This was no longer about one medal or one judge's wounded pride. It had become a test of whether power could silence dignity, whether sacrifice could be diminished by those who had never made one, whether justice truly wore a blindfold or merely pretended not to see. Walter visited Evelyn's grave again, sitting beside the headstone in the gathering darkness. "They're coming at me from all sides, Evie," he whispered, "making me pay for standing my ground, making our family pay." The silence offered no answers, but the familiar ritual of sharing his burdens with Evelyn, even in death, centered him. Meanwhile, Angela Chen continued her investigation, digging deeper into Barrett's history. She discovered his membership in exclusive clubs with documented histories of discriminatory policies, clubs that had fought integration until forced by law to admit minorities, and even then had established prohibitive membership fees and opaque application processes to maintain de facto segregation. She traced campaign donations connecting Barrett to property developers who had systematically pushed black families out of gentrifying neighborhoods through questionable eviction proceedings, cases Barrett had consistently ruled on despite clear conflicts of interest. The pieces formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Walter, unaware of Chen's discoveries, made his own decision. He would file a formal complaint against Barrett with the Judicial Ethics Committee, challenging the legal basis for the judge's order and documenting the pattern of retaliation that had followed his stand. It was a step that would either break the stalemate or escalate it beyond control. As Walter prepared the paperwork, Barrett sat in his wood-paneled study across town, nursing a scotch and making phone calls to allies, calling in favors accumulated over decades. Neither man would back down. Neither man could afford to lose. The confrontation had moved beyond a courtroom dispute to become a battle over whose America would prevail, the one Walter had bled for or the one Barrett had inherited. The morning after Walter filed his complaint with the Judicial Ethics Committee, his phone rang with an unexpected call. "Mr. Freeman, this is Regina Washington with the Southern Justice Initiative. I've been following your situation with Judge Barrett, and I'd like to offer our legal services, pro bono, of course." Walter recognized the name immediately. Washington was a prominent civil rights attorney who had won landmark cases against institutional discrimination across the South. Her involvement would transform the scope of the confrontation. "That's a generous offer, Ms. Washington," Walter replied. "But I should warn you, Judge Barrett seems determined to make this difficult for anyone associated with me." Washington's laugh held no humor. "Judge Barrett and I have crossed paths before, Mr. Freeman. He doesn't scare me. Men like him rely on intimidation because their legal foundation is quicksand." While Walter considered Washington's offer, something extraordinary began happening across the country. Veterans from every state started sending their own medals to Walter in solidarity. Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, Silver Stars arrived by mail, each with a note of support. "Wear mine too," wrote a Marine from Oregon. "My grandfather earned this in Korea," penned a woman from Florida. "He would stand with you." The medals arrived. By the dozens, then hundreds, a physical manifestation of support that could not be ignored or dismissed. Marcus, meanwhile, had connected with law students nationwide. Using social media and legal forums, he built a network researching similar cases of judicial overreach. "Barrett isn't the first judge to abuse his authority," Marcus told Walter, "but we're documenting patterns that could help not just your case, but others facing similar situations." Their work caught the attention of a retired Supreme Court justice who made a public statement questioning Barrett's legal reasoning. "Judicial authority must be exercised within constitutional bounds," the statement read. "Directing a citizen to remove a military decoration representing sacrifice for our nation appears to exceed those bounds." Walter received a call from General Michael Richardson, a four-star general under whom he had served briefly during Desert Storm. "Freeman," the familiar voice barked. "Richardson here, heard you're still fighting the good fight. My staff is reaching out to the Pentagon. This Barrett character picked the wrong veteran to bully." The support extended beyond military circles. The young defendant, Jamal Williams, had his case transferred to another judge after mounting pressure, forced Barrett to recuse himself. The new judge, reviewing the evidence, dismissed the charges entirely, citing insufficient proof and questionable police procedure. In Washington, D.C., a bipartisan group of veteran lawmakers expressed concern about the precedent Barrett's order might set. "We cannot allow decorated veterans to be dishonored in the very institutions their sacrifice protects," declared Congresswoman Eleanor Martinez, herself a former Army captain. Walter's story reached Captain James Whitfield, a white veteran whose life Walter had saved during the firefight that earned him his Purple Heart. Whitfield came forward publicly, granting interviews describing how Walter had carried him to safety despite his own severe injuries. "I have 3 children and 4 grandchildren because Walter Freeman valued my life above his own safety," Whitfield told a national news program. "Anyone questioning his honor or his right to wear that Purple Heart is questioning the very meaning of sacrifice." The Army responded to the anonymous complaint against Walter by releasing his service records, an unusual move that demonstrated the military's position. The records detailed Walter's exemplary service, multiple commendations, and the specific action that earned his Purple Heart, effectively countering the smear campaign. Angela Chen's investigation continued bearing fruit. Her analysis of Barrett's court records revealed he had dismissed 3 times as many black jurors as white ones over the past 5 years, a statistical anomaly too significant to be random chance. She published her findings in a front-page exposé that drew attention from national media outlets and civil rights organizations. A social media campaign dubbed Yuck Medals of Honor went viral, with veterans posting photos wearing their decorations in solidarity with Walter. Public figures from sports stars to celebrities shared the hashtag, amplifying Walter's story far beyond Birmingham. Marcus organized fellow law students to provide free legal assistance to others who had faced questionable rulings in Barrett's court, establishing a pattern of bias that strengthened Walter's ethics complaint. Walter himself remained steadfast but reluctant to become a figurehead. When invited to speak at a veterans rally organized in his honor, he declined. "This isn't about me," he told the organizers. "It's about respect for sacrifice, no matter who makes it. I don't need a spotlight." Tanya discovered through her community connections that Barrett had ruled favorably in multiple cases involving members of his exclusive golf club, including dismissing serious charges against the son of a prominent member and ruling consistently for development companies owned by his regular golfing partners. These conflicts of interest added another dimension to Chen's investigation. Walter began receiving letters from other black veterans sharing similar experiences of discrimination despite their service. "Wore my uniform to my son's custody hearing," wrote a former Navy corpsman. "Judge asked if I'd rented it for the occasion. Applied for a business loan wearing my service pins," another wrote. "Loan officer asked if they were music awards. Each letter confirmed what Walter already knew. His experience was not isolated, but systemic, the tip of an iceberg of disrespect many had faced in silence. The Judicial Ethics Committee agreed to investigate Barrett, but warned the process could take months. "These proceedings are necessarily thorough," the chairperson told Walter in a formal letter. "We appreciate your patience as we examine all aspects of your complaint." The stress began taking a physical toll on Walter. The pain in his leg intensified, and nightmares from his combat days returned with new vigor. The VA finally restored his pension after public pressure, but the delay had forced him to deplete his modest savings. During a particularly difficult night when pain kept him from sleeping, Walter received an unexpected call. "Mr. Freeman, this is Judge Samuel Tompkins, retired. We haven't met, but I served on the bench with Richard Barrett for several years." The elderly voice paused. "What I'm about to tell you isn't for attribution, but you should know Barrett has powerful connections protecting him. The governor was his roommate at law school. The state attorney general was best man at his wedding. They won't let him fall without a fight." Walter thanked the retired judge for his candor. "I'm not trying to destroy Judge Barrett," Walter said. "I just couldn't dishonor my service or the men who died beside me." Tompkins sighed heavily. "Principles are expensive these days, Mr. Freeman. Barrett doesn't understand men like you. Never had to fight for anything in his life. Everything handed to him on a silver platter. Men who've never been tested can't comprehend those who have been forged by fire." As Walter hung up, he reflected on the unexpected allies who had emerged in his corner. Regina Washington with her legal brilliance, Marcus and his network of idealistic law students, Angela Chen pursuing truth with journalistic integrity, General Richardson wielding his considerable influence, Captain Whitfield telling the world about Walter's heroism, neighbors scrubbing hate from his walls in the dark. Each represented a different facet of the America Walter had fought for, an America that still existed alongside Barrett's version, each struggling for dominance in the national soul. The battle lines were clearly drawn now, the stakes established. Barrett had wealth, position, and powerful friends in his corner. Walter had sacrifice, dignity, and growing public support in his. In America's long struggle toward justice, such confrontations had always defined the national character, revealing what the country truly valued when principles collided with power. As June turned to July, Walter received notice that the Ethics Committee had agreed to expedite his case, a rare concession that suggested the seriousness with which they viewed his complaint. The public pressure had forced an acknowledgement that this was no ordinary dispute, but a referendum on respect for sacrifice in a nation built on the service of citizens like Walter Freeman. Regina Washington prepared to present their case, organizing evidence of Barrett's pattern of discrimination and abuse of authority. Walter's quiet stand had evolved into a movement that transcended his individual situation, becoming instead a test of whether America would honor its stated values or merely pay them lip service. Barrett, sensing the shifting momentum, prepared his counterattack. Judge Richard Barrett had never lost a significant battle in his professional life. Rising from an elite law school to a prestigious firm to the bench, his path had been smoothed by family connections and the old boy network that still dominated Birmingham's power structure. Walter Freeman's defiance and the subsequent public reaction represented not just a challenge to his authority, but a threat to the system that had elevated and protected men like Barrett for generations. His counterattack began with a formal lawsuit against Walter, claiming defamation and alleging the veteran was deliberately endangering the court and its personnel by inciting public hostility toward a sitting judge. The suit demanded $3 million in damages, an astronomical sum designed to intimidate rather than to reflect any actual harm. State judicial authorities, many with personal or professional ties to Barrett, issued statements supporting respect for the bench and warning against emotionally driven attacks on our justice system. The measured language barely concealed the circling of wagons around one of their own. Barrett appeared on sympathetic media outlets, portraying himself as the victim of a political witch hunt. "This was never about Mr. Freeman's medal," he told our friendly interviewer. "It was about maintaining the dignity and impartiality of our courts. No one is above the basic rules of courtroom decorum, regardless of their background." Walter's military service record, previously confirmed by the Army's unusual release of his files, became the target of renewed scrutiny. Barrett's allies hired private investigators to interview former military colleagues, seeking any inconsistencies or exaggerations in Walter's account of his service. They found none, but the very act of investigation cast an implied shadow. A support judicial independence rally organized by Barrett supporters drew several hundred attendees to the courthouse steps. Speakers emphasized the importance of law and order and respecting our institutions, carefully avoiding direct references to Walter, while unmistakably positioning Barrett as a defender of tradition against chaos. Walter experienced an increase in police attention, being pulled over 3 times in a single week for minor or non-existent infractions, each stop prolonged and thorough. The message was clear: you are being watched. Anonymous threats escalated against Walter's family members. Tanya received disturbing emails at work. Marcus found his car vandalized outside his apartment. Walter maintained his composure through it all, refusing to be provoked into actions that might undermine his position or justify Barrett's portrayal of him as a dangerous agitator. Through diligent research, Walter discovered Barrett had connections to real estate developers who had been systematically forcing black families out of their homes in gentrifying neighborhoods, using legal technicalities and Barrett's courtroom as their instrument. These same developers had contributed generously to Barrett's re-election campaigns and belonged to the same exclusive clubs. As July progressed, the case began to fracture along political lines. What had started as a straightforward matter of respect for military service became reframed by Barrett's allies as a question of judicial independence versus mob rule. Conservative commentators warned of activist veterans undermining the court system, while progressive voices highlighted the racial dynamics of a white judge demanding a black veteran remove symbols of his sacrifice. Walter's VA medical benefits were suddenly under review, delaying treatments for his chronic pain and PTSD. The reviewing office cited administrative discrepancies that required resolution before services could continue, though they couldn't specify what those discrepancies might be. Regina Washington's law firm faced spurious ethics complaints filed anonymously with the state bar. Simultaneously, the IRS initiated an audit of the firm's last 3 years of tax filings, a coincidence too precise to be random. Barrett's powerful friends pressured local businesses to withdraw support from Walter. The grocery store that had initially refused him credit now faced health department inspections. The barbershop where Walter had his hair cut for 20 years received citations for code violations that had previously been ignored. A coordinated media campaign questioned whether Walter was being used by political interests seeking to undermine the judiciary for partisan gain. Opinion pieces appeared suggesting the decorated veteran might be an unwitting pawn in a larger game, a narrative that subtly diminished his agency and judgment. Walter discovered he wasn't Barrett's first target. Through community connections, he learned of others who had faced similar treatment after crossing the judge, most silenced through various means of pressure or intimidation. Few had Walter's resources or public platform, making them more vulnerable to Barrett's tactics. Angela Chen faced pressure of her own. Her editor received calls from major advertisers threatening to pull their business if the biased reporting continued. To his credit, the editor stood firm, but Chen was warned to ensure every fact was triple verified, every source impeccable. The pressure increased when Walter faced a health crisis related to his combat injuries. The bullet fragment near his spine, stable for years, shifted slightly, causing intense pain and partial numbness in his right leg. Without his VA benefits active, Walter faced limited treatment options and mounting medical bills. Despite these challenges, Walter maintained his dignity and refused to respond with anger or bitterness. "I faced worse in combat," he told Marcus during a hospital visit. "At least no one's shooting at me." Marcus squeezed his grandfather's hand. "Not with bullets anyway." What else could Judge Barrett possibly do to silence Walter and his supporters? Comment number 1 if you think Barrett's tactics will eventually succeed, or number 2 if you believe Walter's quiet dignity will prevail in the end. Hit like if you're inspired by Walter's courage in the face of such powerful opposition, and subscribe to follow this story to its conclusion. How far will Barrett go to protect his position and reputation? What will be the turning point in this battle between power and principle? Let's continue and find out. The turning point came on a sweltering August morning when Angela Chen published her most explosive exposé yet. Titled The Court of King Barrett, Discrimination, Corruption and Abuse of Power, the comprehensive investigation laid bare the judge's history of preferential treatment, financial conflicts of interest, and systematic discrimination. Chen had obtained internal court emails through a Freedom of Information Act request, revealing Barrett's explicit instructions to his staff about jury selection. Avoid certain demographics, one email read. You know which ones cause problems. Most damning was an audio recording provided by a former court clerk, capturing Barrett making explicitly racist comments about Walter and other black veterans. These people think a uniform and some medals make them special, Barrett's voice clearly stated. Freeman needs to learn his place, just like the rest of them. The recording, professionally authenticated and time-stamped just days after Walter's initial appearance in Barrett's courtroom, shattered the judge's carefully constructed public persona. Within hours of Chen's article being published, several of Barrett's former clerks came forward with corroborating accounts. They described a pattern of jury manipulation based on race, with Barrett explicitly directing them to find reasons to dismiss black jurors, especially in cases with black defendants. He called it maintaining balance, one former clerk revealed, but it was clearly about ensuring fewer black jurors on certain cases. The Federal Bureau of Investigation announced a preliminary inquiry into potential civil rights violations within Barrett's courtroom. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division opened a separate investigation into patterns of discrimination in the county's judicial system, using Barrett's court as a starting point, but examining the entire structure. Walter's case gained unprecedented support from military leaders across political divides. A joint statement, signed by 5 former secretaries of defense and dozens of generals and admirals, condemned any attempt to diminish the symbols of sacrifice worn by those who have served this nation. Jamal Williams, the young defendant from the original case that brought Walter to Barrett's courtroom, was fully exonerated after evidence emerged of police misconduct in his arrest. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and the police chief issued a public apology to the Williams family. Military and veterans organizations filed a joint amicus brief supporting Walter's position in both the ethics complaint and in defense against Barrett's lawsuit. The brief cited numerous precedents establishing the right of veterans to wear their decorations in public settings, including courtrooms. Barrett's personal and financial connections to private prison companies were exposed in Chen's investigation. Records showed he had consistently sentenced black and Hispanic defendants to longer terms than white defendants for identical offenses, directly benefiting companies in which he held substantial investments. Walter, whose health had deteriorated under the stress of the confrontation, was hospitalized with complications from his war injuries. The story of his admission to the Birmingham VA Medical Center without active benefits created another wave of public outrage. From his hospital bed, Walter gave his first public statement since the beginning of the conflict. "This was never about me or Judge Barrett as individuals," he said, his voice weak but resolute. "It was about whether we truly honor sacrifice, regardless of who makes it. It was about whether the Constitution I nearly died defending applies equally to all Americans or only to some." Veterans groups organized a vigil outside the hospital, standing in silent support through the night. Images of decorated service members from all branches, races, and generations maintaining their solemn watch spread across social media and news outlets, creating a powerful visual counterpoint to Barrett's claims of victimhood. Barrett, growing desperate as his position crumbled, attempted to destroy evidence of his misconduct. He ordered his staff to delete emails and shred documents related to jury selection practices. Unknown to Barrett, his newest clerk, Melissa Saunders, had been documenting his actions since Chen's initial reporting began. Troubled by what she had witnessed, Saunders became a whistleblower, providing federal investigators with detailed accounts of Barrett's attempts to obstruct justice. Governor Robert Callaway, once Barrett's staunch defender and law school roommate, held a press conference to distance himself from the embattled judge. "While I believe in the presumption of innocence, the allegations against Judge Barrett are deeply troubling and merit a full investigation," the governor stated, carefully positioning himself away from his former friend as political winds shifted. Walter declined numerous offers for exclusive interviews and book deals, some offering hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This isn't about money or fame," he told Regina Washington. "It's about principle, always has been." Congressional hearings were announced to investigate discrimination in the judicial system nationwide, with Walter's case as a central example. The House Judiciary Committee issued subpoenas for Barrett's records and scheduled testimony from affected parties, including Walter himself. The ethics charges against Barrett multiplied as more victims of his discriminatory practices came forward. The state's Judicial Qualifications Commission, initially reluctant to act, now faced its own scrutiny for past inaction and accelerated its investigation. Walter received an official apology from the court administration, delivered in person by William Hargrove, the same official who had previously pressured him to back down. Walter's response was measured but firm. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Hargrove, but I cannot accept an apology unless it comes with systemic changes to prevent this from happening to others." Barrett's supporters began abandoning him as evidence of his misconduct mounted. The Support Judicial Independence social media groups went silent. The rallies stopped. Former allies in the legal community issued statements expressing concern and disappointment about the revelations. Walter's health improved gradually, bolstered by the support of community members who organized meal deliveries, transportation for Tanya and Marcus to visit him, and even a fundraiser to cover medical expenses until his VA benefits were reinstated. The hospital room filled with cards and letters from veterans and civilians alike, many sharing their own experiences of discrimination and drawing inspiration from Walter's stand. As August turned to September, the legal landscape had transformed entirely. Barrett, once seemingly untouchable, now fought for his professional survival. Walter, once isolated and pressured from all sides, now had the support of a movement that transcended Birmingham, transcended even the specific issue of veterans' rights, to touch on fundamental questions of dignity, respect, and equal justice. The hospital television in Walter's room broadcast news of Barrett's suspension pending the ethics investigation and federal inquiry. Tanya turned up the volume as the announcement was made. "They actually did it," she said, squeezing her father's hand. "They actually held him accountable." Walter nodded slowly. "The system can work," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just needs a little help remembering what it's supposed to do." Barrett's suspension marked a crucial victory, but Walter knew the larger battle for systemic change had only just begun. The structures that had protected and elevated Barrett remained largely intact, and the discriminatory practices he had embodied were not limited to one judge or one courtroom. As Walter's strength returned, he prepared to take his stand from a hospital bed to congressional chambers, where his testimony might help forge lasting change from the crucible of his individual experience. The Purple Heart on his bedside table caught the afternoon light, its colors as vibrant as the day he received it. Like Walter himself, it had weathered attempts to diminish its significance, and emerged with its honor intact, a small but powerful symbol of sacrifice recognized and finally, properly respected. Walter Freeman's appearance before the Congressional Committee on Judicial Oversight created an image that resonated across the nation. The 62-year-old veteran sat tall in his wheelchair, oxygen tubes in his nostrils, but determination in his eyes, his Purple Heart prominently displayed on his chest. The hearing room fell silent as he began his testimony, his voice gaining strength with each carefully chosen word. "I am not here to seek vengeance against Judge Barrett or anyone else," Walter stated. "I am here because what happened to me happens to countless Americans every day, most without the platform or support I've been fortunate to receive." For over 2 hours, Walter detailed his experience in Barrett's courtroom and the subsequent retaliation. His testimony was calm, measured and devastating in its detailed account of systematic discrimination. He avoided inflammatory language or personal attacks, instead focusing on documented facts and observable patterns. The power of his testimony lay not in emotional appeals, but in its methodical exposition of injustice operating in plain sight. Marcus had prepared extensive documentation showing dozens of similar cases from Barrett's court, revealing a pattern of disparate treatment based on race. Walter presented this evidence not with anger, but with the same precision he had once brought to military operations, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. National media covered the hearings extensively, making Walter an unwilling symbol of resistance to judicial overreach. His composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate statements from Barrett's legal team, who attempted to frame the investigation as a political witch hunt. "This isn't political," Walter told the committee. "Justice shouldn't depend on who you are, what you look like, or whether you've worn a uniform. Either we believe in equal treatment under law, or we don't. There's no middle ground on that principle." Barrett himself was forced to testify in the following session. Once imperious and commanding, the judge appeared diminished under the committee's questioning. When confronted with the audio recording of his racist comments, Barrett attempted to claim they had been taken out of context, only to crumble when asked to explain what possible context could justify such statements. "I was under stress," Barrett stammered. "It was a difficult day in court." The explanation fell flat, particularly in contrast to Walter's composure under far greater pressure. The Judicial Ethics Committee issued an unprecedented censure of Barrett, finding him guilty of multiple violations of judicial conduct. The formal report cited clear patterns of bias, abuse of judicial authority, and conduct unbecoming a judicial officer. Walter's fine was officially vacated, and the court system issued a formal apology, acknowledging the impropriety of Barrett's order regarding the Purple Heart. Faced with mounting evidence and collapsing support, Barrett resigned rather than face formal removal proceedings. His resignation letter, leaked to the press, attempted to frame his departure as a principled stand against political interference in the judiciary rather than an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Few found the framing convincing. The resignation triggered an automatic review of Barrett's cases, particularly those involving minority defendants or jurors. The review, initially expected to examine a small sample of decisions, expanded as patterns of discrimination became increasingly apparent. Eventually, over 200 cases would be flagged for potential reconsideration. Walter established a legal defense fund for veterans facing discrimination, using donations sent to him during the height of the controversy. The Walter Freeman Veterans Justice Initiative, with Marcus as its first director, provided pro bono legal assistance to veterans navigating the court system, particularly those from minority communities. The State Bar Association began examining all of Barrett's cases involving minorities, creating a special task force to identify patterns of bias and recommend remedies for affected parties. The initiative sparked similar reviews in other jurisdictions, as legal professionals recognized the potential for unaddressed discrimination throughout the system. Several other judges with similar records faced new scrutiny across the country. In Ohio, a judge who had ordered a Muslim woman to remove her hijab resigned after public outcry. In California, a judge with a documented pattern of harsher sentences for Hispanic defendants was placed under investigation. Walter's stand had created a ripple effect, encouraging examination of judicial conduct nationwide. Marcus graduated law school with honors, despite the earlier threats to his scholarship. His commencement speech focused on the responsibility of legal professionals to ensure justice remains blind to irrelevant distinctions while seeing clearly the humanity of all who come before the courts. Walter, still recovering from his health crisis, but improving steadily, attended the ceremony with immense pride. Walter continued to suffer health consequences from the stress of the confrontation, but found purpose in the movement his stand had created. The VA, after a thorough review prompted by congressional inquiry, not only reinstated his benefits, but identified and corrected similar administrative reviews affecting dozens of other veterans, particularly minorities. Draft legislation was introduced called the Freeman Respect Act, designed to protect veterans in legal proceedings and establish clear guidelines prohibiting discrimination based on military service. The bipartisan bill also included provisions strengthening judicial accountability and transparency, requiring courts to maintain records of juror demographics and judicial recusals. Walter was invited to the White House to discuss the legislation, but requested that other affected veterans be included in the meeting. "This isn't about one man's experience," he insisted. "It's about making sure the system works equally for everyone who has served this country, regardless of their background." Barrett, meanwhile, faced disbarment proceedings and potential criminal charges for obstruction of justice related to his attempts to destroy evidence. The once powerful judge now retained counsel of his own, his legal fees mounting as his former allies continued to distance themselves from his disgrace. As fall turned to winter, Walter's health stabilized enough for him to return to limited activity. He began speaking at community events, not about his own case specifically, but about broader issues of justice and civic responsibility. Citizenship isn't passive, he often said. It requires participation and sometimes sacrifice. Democracy doesn't defend itself. Angela Chen's reporting on the case earned her nominations for several prestigious journalism awards. Her persistent investigation had uncovered not just Barrett's misconduct, but an entire network of privilege and protection that had insulated powerful figures from accountability for decades. She and Walter developed a respectful friendship, united by their commitment to truth and justice, despite coming from different generations and backgrounds. In December, Walter testified again, this time before the Senate Judiciary Committee, considering the Freeman Respect Act. His testimony focused not on his personal vindication, but on the need for systemic reform. "This legislation isn't about protecting veterans from disrespect," he explained. "It's about ensuring our legal system lives up to the ideals veterans fight to defend. The two are inseparable." The committee chairman, a Vietnam veteran himself, responded, "Mr. Freeman, you've fought for this country twice now, once in uniform and once in civilian clothes. Both battles were necessary, and both matter." As the year drew to a close, Walter received word that the Freeman Respect Act had cleared committee and would receive a floor vote in the new year. The legislation had evolved from its initial focus on veterans' rights to include broader judicial accountability measures, creating a legacy far beyond what Walter had imagined when he first stood his ground in Barrett's courtroom. On New Year's Eve, Walter sat in his living room surrounded by family and a few close friends. Tanya had prepared a special dinner, and Marcus had returned from his new job with a civil rights law firm in Washington, D.C. The television showed celebrations around the country, but the true celebration was in this room, where a man who had simply refused to dishonor his sacrifice had sparked a movement that promised to make America's courts more just for generations to come. As midnight approached, Walter raised a glass in a toast. "To Evelyn," he said, remembering his late wife, "who always told me to stand my ground." Tanya added, "And to dignity that cannot be commanded away." Marcus completed the toast, "And to justice that's still a work in progress." The new year would bring the final chapter in Walter's confrontation with Barrett, but the impact of his stand had already transcended both men to touch something fundamental about America's ongoing struggle to align its practices with its ideals. 1 year after Walter Freeman first entered Judge Barrett's courtroom wearing his Purple Heart, he stood in the East Room of the White House, watching as the president signed the Freeman Respect Act into law. The legislation guaranteed the right of veterans to wear military decorations in any federal building or proceeding, but its scope extended far beyond that initial spark. The act established new accountability measures for judicial discrimination and misconduct, including transparent reporting requirements, whistleblower protections, and an accessible complaint process for those who believed they had experienced bias in the courts. Walter stood proudly in his full-dress uniform, Purple Heart gleaming on his chest, no longer a point of contention but a symbol of a battle fought and won, twice over. Surrounding him were dozens of veterans from diverse backgrounds, each with their own stories of service and sacrifice, each now protected by legislation bearing Walter's name. Across town, in a much smaller apartment than he once owned, Richard Barrett watched the signing ceremony on television. The former judge, now disbarred and under federal indictment for obstruction of justice, had experienced a precipitous fall. His exclusive club memberships revoked, his investments depleted by legal fees, his former friends scarce, Barrett had ample time to reflect on the chain of events his arrogance had triggered. The young defendant from the original case, Jamal Williams, stood beside Walter at the White House ceremony. Following his exoneration, Jamal had begun working with Walter's foundation, helping others navigate a system that had nearly destroyed his own future. "Mr. Freeman showed me that standing up doesn't always mean shouting," Jamal told a reporter. "Sometimes it's just refusing to be moved when you know you're right." Walter's health had stabilized thanks to proper medical care finally being provided by the VA. The bullet fragment near his spine had been successfully removed in a surgery that would have happened years earlier if not for systemic delays in veteran healthcare, another issue the Freeman Act addressed through accountability provisions. Angela Chen won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation, bringing national attention to judicial discrimination beyond Walter's individual case. Her series of articles had exposed not just Barrett's misconduct, but an entire ecosystem of privilege and protection that had allowed such abuses to flourish unchecked for decades. In her acceptance speech, Chen credited Walter's quiet courage for making her reporting possible. "Walter Freeman could have removed his medal and gone home," she said. "The fact that he didn't force all of us, including me, to look more closely at systems we too often take for granted." Throughout the controversy, Walter's quiet dignity had proven more powerful than angry protests could have been. By refusing to be baited into behaviors that might reinforce stereotypes or justify Barrett's claims about him, Walter had maintained the moral high ground that ultimately proved decisive in the court of public opinion. Marcus passed the bar, exam with honors, and joined a civil rights firm specializing in veterans' cases. His experience supporting his grandfather through the confrontation had shaped his professional path, combining his legal training with a first-hand understanding of how justice functioned and sometimes failed to function in practice. The judicial system in Alabama underwent significant reforms following the Barrett scandal. A more diverse bench began to emerge as previously overlooked candidates received serious consideration for judgeships. Mandatory bias training was implemented for all court personnel, and transparency measures made jury selection processes open to greater scrutiny. Walter began visiting schools to teach children about citizenship, service, and standing up for what's right. His message transcended politics, focusing instead on the responsibilities that came with being an American and the importance of ensuring the nation's practices aligned with its professed values. At the National Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention, Walter received a standing ovation from thousands of veterans who recognized in his civilian stand the same courage he had shown in combat. "Freedom needs defending at home, not just abroad," Walter told the assembly, "sometimes with weapons, sometimes with words, always with dignity." As Walter's story spread, it inspired others to stand their ground against injustice in their own communities. A high school student in Oregon successfully challenged a dress code that disproportionately targeted black hairstyles. A nurse in Michigan exposed discriminatory treatment patterns in her hospital's emergency department. Each cited Walter's example as inspiration for their own acts of principled resistance. In perhaps the most unexpected development, Walter received a letter from Barrett 6 months after the former judge's disbarment. The handwritten note, delivered without fanfare, contained something few had thought possible: a genuine apology. "Mr. Freeman," Barrett wrote, "I have had ample time to reflect on my actions and their impact. My order regarding your Purple Heart was not about courtroom decorum, but about my own discomfort with what you represent, a black man whose sacrifice and dignity commanded respect I was unwilling to give. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can acknowledge it without excuses. You deserved better from me and from the system I was entrusted to uphold." The letter revealed Barrett's own journey toward recognizing his privilege and prejudice, prompted by the complete collapse of the protective structures that had insulated him from consequence throughout his career. Walter considered the letter for several days before deciding to visit Barrett in person. Their meeting in Barrett's modest apartment was brief but significant. No reporters were present, no statements issued afterward. What passed between the two men remained private, but those who knew Walter well noted a sense of closure in his demeanor afterward, a weight lifted not through vengeance, but through the more difficult path of accountability with reconciliation. On the anniversary of Evelyn's death, Walter visited her grave as he did every year. The veteran's cemetery was peaceful in the autumn light, rows of identical headstones reflecting the democracy of sacrifice. Walter sat beside his wife's marker, his purple heart pinned to his jacket as always. "We did something important, Evie," he said softly. "Our grandkids will grow up in a slightly more just world because of it. Not perfect, not even close, but better. Sometimes that's all we can do, make things a little better for those who come after us." Walter's legacy extended far beyond one court case, or even the legislation bearing his name. He had demonstrated that dignity could not be commanded away, that respect had to be given to be received, and that systems only worked when people of conscience insisted they work as intended. The final scene of Walter's story played out far from Birmingham, at a military hospital in Germany. A young black soldier received a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat, the medal presented with full honors and genuine respect. When she returned home months later, she entered a courthouse wearing that medal and found herself before a judge who acknowledged its significance with a nod of recognition. The path from battlefield to bench had been made smoother by a man she had never met, a veteran who had refused to be dishonored, and in so doing had helped bend the arc of justice a few degrees closer to its promised destination. What would you do if faced with a choice between standing your ground on principle or taking the easier path of compliance? Has Walter's story inspired you to think differently about what one person's quiet dignity can accomplish? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find strength in Walter Freeman's example. Thank you for joining me for this powerful journey from injustice to transformation. Remember, sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in everyday moments when we simply refuse to compromise our dignity. Walter Freeman's story teaches us that dignity cannot be commanded away, and principles are worth defending even at great personal cost. His refusal to remove his Purple Heart wasn't about defiance, but about honoring sacrifice, his own and that of those who served alongside him. The power of quiet dignity proved more effective than angry protest, demonstrating that standing firm without escalation can be the most powerful form of resistance. Walter showed that systems only improve when people of conscience demand they work as intended. This story reveals how institutions can shield those who abuse power and how prejudice can hide behind the veneer of authority. But it also shows that no position is unassailable when confronted with unwavering moral clarity. Walter's stand created ripples that grew into waves of change, proving that individual actions matter. Perhaps most importantly, Walter's journey demonstrates that justice is not automatic. It requires vigilance and courage. True patriotism isn't blind allegiance, but the determination to hold America accountable to its highest ideals. By refusing to compromise his dignity, Walter Freeman didn't just win his personal battle. He strengthened the foundation of justice for countless others who would follow. Has there been a moment in your life when you had to choose between standing your ground or taking the easier path? Walter's story reminds us that sometimes one person's quiet dignity can change an entire system. Share your story of standing up for what's right in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken up? Or perhaps you did speak up. Tell us what happened. If Walter's courage inspired you, please hit that like button to help more people discover his powerful journey. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change through moral courage. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about the power of principled resistance, share this video with them today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Walter Freeman's fight for dignity and respect. Remember, justice doesn't defend itself. It needs people like you who refuse to be moved when you know you're right.